Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 3 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 28th Other Minds Festival, which will take place September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. This month, we're excited to be bringing you 2 interviews with authors of recent books on contemporary music that I found very interesting, and I think you will too. Today, I'm joined by Jennie Gottschalk. Gottschalk is a composer and author based in Boston. She holds a doctorate from Northwestern University, and her dissertation and current work explores connections between American pragmatist thought and experimental music. Jennie is also the author of the very informative book Experimental Music Since 1970, published in 2016. In the book, she answers the question, what is experimental music today? With a survey of composers in the field, many of whom will be familiar to followers of Other Minds, and I'm very pleased to be discussing it with her today. Welcome to the podcast, Jennie.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be here.
I think we should start out with a perhaps obvious and difficult question. What is experimental music?
Oh, boy. I think you would be hard-pressed to find 2 people in the field agreeing on a single definition. For me, I think it mostly has to do with openness and indeterminacy and a focus on those elements in the work, wherever that's placed, whether that's in the making of the work and the performance of the work and the reception of it, that interest in what happens and openness to what's possible and what's not yet known that comes through. That, to me, is a hallmark of what's experimental.
So are you thinking of it in like a scientific sense, in terms of you have a question that's trying to be answered by the experiment?
It could be in that sense. It could be in a much more abstract sense as well. But yeah, I think very much in terms of questions and open questions. And, if you go in not knowing the answer and being open to various possibilities that can come up. So that mirrors a scientific model, but it may or may not take shape in an obviously scientific way.
In the opening, you identify 5 different elements: indeterminacy, change, non-subjectivity, research, and experience. Could you talk about how you decided on those categories?
Yeah, and that was interesting for me to go back to in preparing for this conversation, because I feel like I might have landed on the same 5 things, but I probably would present it differently now than I did then. And I think really the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th parts of that are all under the umbrella, more or less, of indeterminacy. So that openness, or that sort of interest in the unknown or in questions or in exploration, can manifest in these various ways. So with change, one way that happens is the change in a perceptual experience. The book that I worked on after this one was a collaborative process with 2 other composers in the UK, Bryn Harrison and Richard Glover, on the perception of time in experimental music. It's called Being Time, Case Studies in Musical Temporality. And we each wrote about pieces that affected our sense of time in some really fundamental way. And one of the pieces that I wrote about was this set of modified field recordings by Toshio Tsunoda called Grains of Spring. And he has these field recordings that then he goes in and will loop either a small segment or a larger segment And I don't know how he chose them or how he did it, but it's like, just completely falling into this abyss. It's different each time, but there's this sort of opening that happens in the midst of something. You think you know where you are, and then suddenly you're somewhere else. And that sense of this shift that happens in the work, in the listener's perceptual experience, is one of the aspects of that opening up and that questioning of what's actually going on. And the non-subjectivity, this is one that I had the most trouble with, actually, in looking it over, because I think the thing that I've struggled with since writing the book especially is the sort of notion that experimental music resists being emotional. And I don't think that's a fair characterization, but it's something that comes up. And the idea that it can't go there, I don't think is true. But I think what I really meant by this, and I don't think I really said it fully in the text there, is this openness to the subjectivity of the various participants, whether that's the maker of the work, the performer, the listener, that it's not bound by one narrative, but it's open to various narratives and various personhoods that can be involved.
Would you relate that idea at all to including audience participation in something like Pauline Oliveros' work with the sonic meditations?
Yeah, because that's sort of opening up. That's a good example of it. It's opening up to the participation and to the specific input of everyone involved. I thought also of, it's in a different way, but the Lucier piece, Music on a Long Thin Wire, the installation, where he talked about, he loved to see the moment where people started to understand what was going on. And it was a different moment for each person. But he sort of set something in motion that then people could respond to in their own terms. And I think often you find this with installations, but Oliveros's work is a great example of creating that space for people to find their own way, versus a more sort of programmed moment by moment. This is what happens here, and this is what people are supposed to, which isn't what all classical music or any kind necessarily does either. But that emphasis on that openness, I think, is the hallmark of more experimental work. And then with research, I think, again, it's sort of playing out this scientific model, this trying things out, not even knowing if it's going to work. And there are varying degrees of that. At some point, you might actually know what you're doing and go in and do it. But that sort of approach of, I don't know what's going to happen, but I need to try it to see. And I'm going to learn something along the way. And that sort of digging in and intensively learning and finding There are all sorts of examples of this, but I think one thing that comes to mind is Eliane Radigue's recent process of working intensively with musicians and finding these sounds together that then she works from something that neither of them could have come up with separately, but that intensive collaboration that in many ways, I think she talked about that being a continuation of the practices that she'd had earlier with synthesizers and with feedback, but sort of these new avenues of digging in and seeing where is this going to go. And then the last experience, that's maybe the broadest of them. Just this idea that, to me, I think this is a newer way of putting it for me, but that it's non-metaphorical, that the sound is actually doing the thing, and it's a real experience and sometimes often a shared experience, but that it's not something somehow separate or on a stage or off and away. And there was a concert I went to, Kath Matthews did this improvisation with this Ripley noise filter system. And I mean, it sounded and felt like we all were on this plane and then a spaceship together, and we went somewhere. And it was unmistakable, and nobody who was in that room didn't go there. It was just, really intensely visceral and real and shared. And that, I think, especially after, COVID and lockdown and everything, those kinds of things mean so much, that sense of being in a room and having an experience together. But it can happen in any number of ways. And also just that opening out of that it's not just, there's a stage and there's the audience and there's a separation, but what is possible and what's my sonic experience in life, and the opening sort of perforating that separation between. So those are just, again, it's just sort of fleshing out in a way the broader idea of indeterminacy that I think plays out and also carries into silence, which there's a section about silence in that opening chapter of the book as well, which is also sort of an opening up of what's happening beyond the prescribed sounds of the work. So trying to get at something. And it's not that every piece or even any piece, that would be termed experimental has all of this, but they're the kinds of things that you might expect to see in that broad territory. That was a lot of what I struggled with in writing the book, was trying to map the space or make some sort of way of navigating that was helpful, but not overly prescriptive or limiting, because it resists being that clearly pinned down or defined. But it still felt worth it to try to do something, because I'd been looking for that sort of map and hadn't found it at all. And so that's sort of what led me to look for this and realize it wasn't there, and try to get something down that people could at least argue with.
Where would you trace back the importance of indeterminacy and perhaps even silence to experimental music too? Would that go back to someone like John Cage or earlier?
I think I can't come up with a better answer. I'm sure there are people that would like to, but he's the clear landmark, and he articulated these things in a very clear way and influenced a lot of people. I would be interested in finding a sort of alternative lineage to that, but I don't have it myself. So I guess for me, the answer is yes, but that is definitely questioned and interrogated in lots of different ways. And there are plenty of people that don't acknowledge that influence, but are still in this territory.
Would you say now, many decades on from Cage's earliest works, that there's a tradition or multiple traditions of experimental music? And what's the relationship between experimental music and the music of the past?
Yeah, that's tricky too. And I think there is. And I think it takes shape often in teacher-student relationships and acknowledged influences and groups that are active. And, I know it affects the work you do if you're working with particular people, and you're going to write different work or play different work depending on who you're working with. And so organizations like Other Minds or the Wandelweiser Collective, there are any number of groups and institutions and organizations where things carry forward and there is a sense of influence and lineage. But at the same time, a lot of the thrust of the idea of experimentation is to sort of break with tradition or break that lineage or do something new. And it's harder to do new things now than ever before, because there are so many living and dead makers, and we're aware of so much. And I've struggled with this idea, not everything has to be a break or a total new innovation. But to me, is there a genuine question? Is there a genuine interest in what's not yet known? And that doesn't need to be breaking something to ask a question. So I think there are ways of bringing those questions and bringing that interrogation to tradition as well, or of just doing something independent of it. And I think there are examples of both. But there is a tradition, and I think it would be ignoring the facts to try to say it was not, there was no tradition, because it's absolutely there. You see the influence and you see the lineage and the carryover. And I just want to see that someone is taking that and making their own way in it, not just asking somebody else's questions, but asking their own questions in their own way, or asking old questions in a new way.
You just mentioned Wandelweiser, and I noticed that you mentioned them a lot in the book. So could you talk about what Wandelweiser is and some of the composers associated with them?
Yeah, I feel like it's an increasingly loose and dispersed set of makers, but they started, I believe it was in the early to mid 90s, and I think they would meet about once a year and put on concerts, and there are still concerts and gatherings and things that go on, mostly in Europe, but there are members from other parts of the world as well. And I think there's been, early on especially, there was a real interest, especially in silence and also indeterminacy. But I think what resulted from that's very interesting is just this proliferation of work and of friendship and of people going deeper, each in their own way, and encouraging each other to do that. So from what I've seen, as they've gotten sort of more known recently, and there's something that was written about them in the New Yorker and that sort of thing. And I think with greater prominence, there's almost, well, it preceded that too, but I think some people have moved away from the sort of early influences and the early focus on silence, and especially Michael Pissarro. He's doing very different work now than he was doing early on, and it almost rubs against what he did before as far as just the noise level of it is quite different. Again, it's hard to pin down. The beginnings were clear, and Michael wrote quite a good article about the sort of formation of the group and what it became, but it's a loose conglomeration of creative activity that includes scores and recordings, and it's been very influential within this field, I would say.
Were there any other collectives or groups or schools of composition that you found were particularly fruitful within the field of experimental music?
I think it's not necessarily collectives, but organizations and, just people doing things and initiating things and making things happen.
Like a sort of DIY ethic to producing?
Whether it's DIY or an institution that actually promotes and supports this kind of work. There aren't that many in the US, but there are some. Other Minds is a great example. I wrote about what I was familiar with and what I had encountered. So I know there are some really interesting things that have gone on in parts of the world I haven't visited yet. But things that I can talk about more directly are like the Subtropics Festival in Miami, in London, the Music We'd Like to Hear concert series that becomes a sort of hub. You know, it's 3 concerts every summer, but people just turn up and you can always expect to hear something that's going along these lines. And it's also just this way of connecting with people that care about that kind of work too. There's a lot going on in particular cities, in Berlin, the Eckzeitmusik, and there's a lot happening. But again, it's this question of familiarity and what I'm ready to speak to. You know, there have been some criticisms that came up that I think are valid about, you know, the lack of inclusion of a lot of Latin American material. And there's some, but I hadn't been to these things and I hadn't experienced them as fully. So sort of expanding that map and seeing what's going on more fully is something that I would love to see other people fill that in. So that was a point of genuine frustration for me, that there was only so much I could do.
While you were working on the book, did you find any surprising parallels between composers that you hadn't thought to connect before?
Yeah, and that was kind of the whole process, actually, was what are the connections that are not social or aesthetic, but just these people are they're traveling along parallel paths. They might never have met or even known each other. And I think I sent a chapter of the book to someone who was in it, and they were thrilled to find these other people they hadn't known about that were going along that similar route. And it was just sort of an opening up. So I think that's kind of what I was trying to do, finding those alignments. I feel like that kind of happened in every subsection, you know, finding these interesting little correlations. So yes, it did happen, but I'm struggling to come up with one example because it's just all peppered through.
Oh, people will have to read the book to find out.
Yeah.
You're also a composer yourself. I'm wondering how your background in composition might have affected the way you approached writing about this work.
Well, it certainly propelled me into it. I got to experimental music I think it was really my last year of graduate school that I realized this is where I was most interested and this is where I lit up. And then it was this question of, okay, so what is it and where is it? Where do I find it? Not just sort of up through the Nyman book, but like, what is it now? What's the current scene?
Can you mention what the Nyman book is for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, it's Experimental Music, Cage and Beyond, which was published, I believe, in about 1970. And that's why my book is since 1970. But I was frustrated by, okay, this is interesting. I want to go to this place, but what is it? And so I sent in a draft of my dissertation to my advisors, and I went to Europe for 6 weeks or something to go to various festivals and try to find it there. And I started to see some things and I started to not see some things, and, you know, just started to draw some connections and figure it out for myself. And also realized I'm not going to find what I'm looking for at any given German festival or UK festival. It's hit or miss, but learning how to look for the thing that mattered to me. And that sort of led me gradually into doing a blog that it's not active right now. I haven't been able to keep up with it, but Sound Expanse, sort of tracking what I was finding, just trying to make a map that I could use of what are people doing and where are they going. I feel like because I have that framework, it gives me a sense of direction in what I'm doing and how I'm choosing to make work.
I have one final question. It's been 8 years since you published your book, and I'm wondering how either your view of experimental music has changed since then, or whether there have been any particularly interesting developments in experimental music in those past 8 years.
I mean, I think very broadly, the biggest development I can see is just since COVID, the real interest in what happens in collective presence and actually being present in a space together. That feels like something that was somewhat known before, but it was missed. And when we got that back, it was tangible. It was really meaningful. And I don't know where that leads from here now, but I think taking the other part of that it's not that I've reversed any position, but I think making more room for the personal, for emotion and personhood and what this field has to offer to people that are going through things in a way. I think the association of experimental with sort of scientific and then clinical does a disservice to the potential of the field.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Jennie Gottschalk's book, Experimental Music Since 1970, is available now wherever books are sold. We'll be back in 2 weeks with my interview with Susan Lolovar about her new book, Embodied Research Through Music Composition and Evocative Life Writing, Disrupting Diaspora. Thank you, Jennie, for talking with me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks very much.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 28th festival is September 25th to 28th, 2024, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.